Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily News for Tuesday, February 22nd. And tonight, the West reacts to a big move by Russia that world leaders are comparing to an invasion. Western leaders are moving quickly to impose sanctions on Russia in response to President Vladimir Putin recognizing the independence of two rebel-held areas in eastern Ukraine. That opened the door for President Putin to formalize his hold on the regions and send forces in. This even though Ukraine and its Western allies have long charged that Russian troops have been fighting there for years. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Russia's unacceptable actions threaten peace in Europe and around the world, and they will not be tolerated. All right, turning to tensions within our own borders. Now that the motion to approve the Emergencies Act has cleared in the House of Commons, it moves on to the Senate. Last evening's vote will keep the measures in place until mid-March at the latest. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the powers were still needed, despite police ending the 3-week occupation in downtown Ottawa by Freedom Convoy protesters and police ending border blockades before that. The motion to confirm the declaration of emergency powers passed 185 to 151, with New Democrats voting in favor alongside the minority Liberal government. The Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois opposed it, while the two Green MPs in the House were split. Meanwhile, a judge has denied bail to one of the key organizers of the anti-vaccine mandate protests in Ottawa. Justice Julie Bourgeois says she wasn't convinced Tamara Lich would not reoffend. Ms. Lich is charged with counseling to commit mischief and had promised to stop her protest activities and return to Alberta if she was released. A separate bail hearing was held this afternoon for fellow protest organizer Pat King. All right, moving to Canada's critical mineral supply chain, which has been dealt a blow by the White House. The U.S. unveiled plans today for what it calls a Made in America supply chain for the rare earth minerals. But despite the protectionist rhetoric, experts are urging Canada, which has critical mineral ambitions of its own, not to panic. A supply chain review last year found the U.S. is overly dependent on foreign sources, especially China. The White House says global demand for critical minerals is expected to increase by more than 400% over the coming decades. Canada's own plans to develop its critical mineral resources depend heavily on U.S. demand for the metals, which are used in the production of EV batteries and components. Some chilly weather is heading for the prairies. Environment Canada has issued extreme cold warnings for most of the prairies and northern Ontario. The weather agency says an Arctic air mass combined with wind is bringing wind chill values near -40 overnight and through Tuesday. This is for eastern British Columbia along the Alberta boundary and for most of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and northern Ontario. While the cold is expected to let up on Wednesday for BC and Alberta, it will linger in the other regions for a couple of days. In Quebec, officials announced new efforts to tackle domestic violence. Public Security Minister Geneviève Guilbeault says the objective is to save lives. Quebec is distributing more than $3 million to police across the province over 3 years to help them support victims of domestic violence and enhance surveillance of offenders. The announcement follows news over the weekend of the deaths of 2 couples in separate murder-suicides. In the East Coast, Nova Scotia's premier says the commissioners leading the inquiry into the 2020 mass shooting that claimed 22 lives are treating the victims' families with disrespect. Tim Houston issued a scathing statement just as the inquiry was about to begin public hearings in Halifax today. Mr. Houston says he's heard family members have expressed frustration about the structure of the inquiry and feel left in the dark. He wants members of the commission to meet with the families and provide them with a plan that gives them confidence in the process. In a move to mark the official start of tax filing season, the Canada Revenue Agency will begin accepting income tax returns on Monday. The agency cautions that it will be another unique tax period as it continues to face challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But the CRA says it has not extended the tax filing deadline, which remains April 30th for most Canadians. Though, because the deadline falls on a Saturday this year, returns filed by May 2nd will be considered on time. The federal tax collector says Canadians need to file their income tax returns so they can receive benefits and credits that they may be entitled to. All right, we'll be right back after the break with a look at ongoing developments in Ukraine. Western leaders are putting together a response to Russia as tensions rise. This after President Vladimir Putin recognized Ukraine's separatist regions and says he will deploy what he calls peacekeepers into Ukraine. Stay with us. The White House says Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to recognize the independence of two rebel-held areas in eastern Ukraine and send in what he calls peacekeepers is an invasion. That sets the stage for strong sanctions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is considering breaking diplomatic ties with Russia, and Kyiv has called its ambassador in Moscow away from the country. But confusion over what exactly is happening in eastern Ukraine is threatening to hobble a Western response. With us today to discuss the developing story is Dr. Balkan Devlin, Senior Fellow and Transatlantic Program Lead at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. Dr. Devlin, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me again.
Now, all eyes are on this developing situation in eastern Ukraine, Doctor. And considering that this is a fluid situation, what do we know so far about the most recent updates on what's happening on the ground?
So yesterday, as we all know, Putin put up this staged meeting with his Security Council, and then announced that they're recognizing the puppet regimes that are set up by the Russian proxy forces in areas that are under the Russian-controlled occupation in Donbass as independent republics. And they announced the so-called peacekeepers, which is basically invasion force, to be moving to those areas. The State Duma, the parliament, Russian parliament, gave the authority to Vladimir Putin to use Russian armed forces to be sent in these places. They not only recognize these so-called republics, but also signed a friendship agreement, which is sort of a euphemism for Russian occupation, legalizing in their perspective the Russian troop presence in the region. How and when they are moving and to where they are moving is still not clear. There's a lot of confusion going on, which is part of the fog of war, which you would expect, confusion and propaganda coming out of Russia in order to put this to confusion to see. And as you pointed out, to prevent a more robust Western response. But so far, what we are seeing is the start of a Russian reinvasion of Ukraine under the pretext of these agreements between these puppet regimes in Russia.
Some very concerning developments, Dr. Devlin. But tell us a little bit more about the overall significance of Russia's move to recognize Ukraine's separatist regions.
First, it is a very clear violation of international law, a violation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It is a violation of UN Charter. It is basically a violation of all the norms and rules that we came to accept after the Second World War as the fundamental determinants of how states should behave in the international arena. So it is very significant when Russia claims that this is just another region that declared independence and we're recognizing it. What they're doing is clearly violating international law by invading Ukraine without any sort of even with the flimsiest of pretext. So it is a very concerning development, because it really brings back or sort of broke this norm, this taboo that after 1945, that the state boundaries should not be changed by using force. And this is what precisely is happening. And this should worry us all.
So how have world leaders responded to this, including the US president?
Biden had a press conference today announcing a number of sanctions targeting both the Russian elite as well as the banks and financial institutions. Same goes for European Union, and the European leaders, including Boris Johnson and Olaf Scholz, are announcing a number of sanctions today. We'll see how far they will go. They all denounced the invasion. One of the most inspiring speeches was given today by the Kenyan representative in UN, basically calling Russia as an imperialist colonial power, highlighting the fact that Kenyan and other Africans know what colonialism is, and they recognize when they see it. So there is a strong reaction coming out. Not everyone is joining. We'll see what China and India and others would do. Syria already, Bashar Assad already recognized those republics, etc. So we will see the lining up of those who are favoring authoritarian regimes on the one hand and democracies on the other. And we will see hopefully further and stronger reactions going beyond what is being announced today, limited economic sanctions, but really targeting the core of Russian kleptocracy, the oligarchs and others, and their ability to continue to pursue this war of subversion against Ukraine and the West.
We'll definitely have to keep an eye out on the situation. Dr. Devlin, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily. Another search using ground-penetrating radar has revealed 54 possible unmarked graves on 2 former residential school sites in eastern Saskatchewan. Kisiku's First Nation believes many images are children. The graves were discovered on the grounds of the Catholic Church-run St. Philip's and Fort Pelly residential schools on the First Nations land near Kamsack. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Roseanne Archibald suggested last week that Canada lower flags every time a recovery has been made in recognition of the horrors faced by children in residential schools. Well, joining us now to talk more on what else needs to be done is Dr. Winona Wheeler from the Fisher River Cree Nation. She is also an Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Wheeler, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Some very heartbreaking discoveries in Saskatchewan, ma'am. What do we know so far about these 54 grave sites discovered at St. Philip's and Fort Pelly residential schools?
Well, we don't know a whole lot more because the ground is still frozen and there's like 3-4 feet of snow on the ground. So they can't do a whole lot more. But there's another 4 hectares of land that they believe might also have unidentified graves on it that they'll start to look at in the spring when the ground thaws up.
And what has been the provincial and federal response following this recent announcement last week?
Well, it was interesting because for the first time you had the Minister of Indian Affairs, you had the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan, and you had the Archbishop from the local Regina Diocese all at the announcement. And that's a first. And so that was pretty, a lot of people were, I would just say they were not empowered, they were relieved to see, you know, these 3 authority bodies represented at this time. And in that they saw some hope that maybe there'd be more action taken.
And speaking of authority, I want to go back to Chief Archibald's comments in terms of lowering flags following further discovery of unmarked graves. What would such a move mean to First Nations communities across the country?
Well, basically it's a respectful show of shared mourning and commemoration. It's what we do as a nation when there's been trauma, when there's been loss of lives, and the loss of the lives of these little people has never been commemorated. They've never even had decent burials or being sent back home to their communities. So it's a show of solidarity in many ways, and so some people might think it's symbolic, but it means a little bit more than that.
And I guess one of the bigger questions here would be whether lowering the flag is enough to recognize the horrors of the residential school system.
No, it'll never be enough. I don't know if anything will ever be enough. There's still so much work that has to be done, you know, that making sure that those little bodies make their way back home, for example, making sure the governments are going to be contributing to do DNA testing to make sure that they can identify who they are so they can be sent home to their home communities. There's a whole lot that needs to be done yet. And the reality is that Canadians are just becoming aware of these atrocities. And so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done educating the public and in this age of reconciliation, trying to find some ways to come together and to help people work through it. Yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done.
Indeed. And in terms of really helping our viewers understand the impact of residential schools, tell us a little bit more about residential schools and the long-term impact they have had on First Nation communities even now.
Well, the residential school system was put into place as part of the federal government's assimilationist policy. And that was their quote unquote Indian policy for over 100 years. that to make us disappear as Indigenous peoples by assimilating us into the Canadian mainstream. And the way they did that was basically beat the culture and the family connections and the social system out of the kids. And so, and I've had 2 generations of my family, well, 3 generations of my family, a couple of older cousins went to residential schools. And the first thing they do is they cut off all your hair, right? And then they put you through this process where you're not allowed to speak your language, where Christianity is imposed on you, and rigorous military-like activities going on at the school, like you're all dressed in uniforms, and you got to think about the impact that 3 to 4 generations of people going to residential schools has on the community at large and on families. It's absolutely devastating. So you got 3 or 4 generations of people having it beaten into them, all of these dehumanizing assaults against their persons and against their people.
I wish I could talk more with you, but we are out of time, so we'll definitely have to bring you back on Forum Daily, ma'am. But thank you so much for joining us today. Russia's upper house of parliament has given President Vladimir Putin permission to use military force outside of the country. That would formalize a Russian military deployment to rebel regions in eastern Ukraine, which Mr. Putin has recognized as independent. It could also signal Mr. Putin intends to launch a broader attack on Ukraine. The UK, EU, and the US have imposed sanctions on Russian banks and oligarchs. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers have been spotted in the Ukrainian regions that Russia has recognized as independent. Mr. Johnson says that amounts to a renewed invasion of Ukraine. Britain is imposing sanctions on 5 Russian banks and 3 oligarchs with interests in energy and infrastructure. The European Union has also unanimously agreed to impose sanctions on several Russian officials and banks that are financing the Russian armed forces. Oil prices jumped overnight amid the rising tensions. Germany is also responding to Russia's actions, taking aim at the country's massive oil industry. Chancellor Olaf Scholz says Germany has taken steps to halt the process of certifying the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia. Chancellor Scholz told the reporters in Berlin on Tuesday that the decision came in response to Moscow's actions in Ukraine. Russia criticized the move, saying it would lead to an increase in gas prices for European consumers. Turning to the lifting of some pandemic measures in Europe, this is where European Union countries have agreed to lift all testing and quarantine requirements for tourists as of next month. The rule would apply to people who received vaccines authorized in the EU or approved by the World Health Organization or have recovered from COVID-19. No tests or additional requirements will apply to children under the age of 6 who are traveling with an adult. Protests continue in the east as opponents of military rule have held demonstrations in Myanmar cities. This despite threats by the authorities to arrest anyone joining demonstrations against the army's takeover a year ago. Tuesday's protests mark the anniversary of a nationwide general strike last year against army rule. The military seized power on February 1, 2021, ousting the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. Back in Northern Europe, countries have been battered by the 3rd major storm in 5 days. Over a dozen people have died across Europe during a week of wild weather. Storm Franklin, which hit Sunday and Monday, killed at least 2 more. It disrupted travel and prompted hundreds of flood alerts across a region that is still recovering from last week's hurricane-force winds. The storm swept across Northern Ireland and Northern England before moving on to France. Moving to the U.S. now, where a huge Louisiana oil refinery has been rocked by an explosion and fire. Company officials say 6 contract workers suffered minor injuries. Officials later gave the all-clear sign, but it was not clear what caused Monday morning's blast at the Marathon Petroleum Corporation plant in Garyville. The refinery along the Mississippi River is one of America's largest. In the Middle East, Dubai's international airport says it was the world's busiest for international travel for the 8th year in a row in 2021, with 29.1 million passengers shuttling through its doors. That is up 12% from 2020 and is seen as a sign that international travel has picked up since the pandemic hit. London's Heathrow Airport and Atlanta's Hartsfield Airport, or rather Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, came in second and third. About 1,000 beehives worth hundreds of thousands of dollars have been reported stolen across California in the past few weeks. It's a crime that occurs uniquely in the state this time of year when almond trees start to bloom. That's when beekeepers from around the United States truck billions of honeybees to California. This to rent them to growers who depend on the insects to pollinate their valuable crop. Experts say a tightening bee supply and the soaring cost to rent a hive is motivating the thieves. And we end the cast with a positive update in the 6-year legal battle for equal pay of U.S. women's soccer players. They have reached a landmark agreement with the sport's American governing body. The deal promises them $24 million plus bonuses that match those of the men. The U.S. Soccer Federation and the women have announced a deal in which the players will split $22 million. This is about 1/3 of what they had sought in damages. The Federation will also establish a $2 million fund to benefit the players in their post-soccer careers and charitable efforts aimed at growing the sport for other women. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.